just wanted to welcome everybody to this Investor Alliance for Human Rights webinar on Sizing Up Big Telecom on Human Rights and Insights for Investors from RDR's 2022 Telco Giants Scorecard. My name is Anita Dorette, and I'm the Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR. For those less familiar with us, the Investor Alliance's goal is to provide a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in the respect for people's fundamental rights. And we do this in one of three ways. First, to promote investor responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct for Institutional Investors. We do this through capacity building activities like this webinar, as well as development of practical tools and guidances like the Investor Toolkit for Human Rights. Secondly, through corporate engagements where we activate a broad base of investors to take on a coordinated approach to engagements with companies on their responsibility to respect human rights. And we'll be hearing more about that today from our two investor discussants. And thirdly, on standard setting, where we engage with policymakers and standard setting bodies to advocate for the creation of enabling environments so that we have a level playing field for responsible business conduct. The Investor Alliance is over 200 institutional investors as members, representing over 12 trillion in assets. With that, I'll just move on to a couple of quick logistics. The first is that we are recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar will be available to all registrants shortly thereafter. The second is that you are all muted at this time, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. You can do this by typing your question into the Q&A box, and we will read this out during the Q&A session, or by virtually raising your hands by clicking the hand icon, which is on the right side of your screen. About the discussion today. So since 2013, RDR, or Ranking Digital Rights, has been a leader in charting the course to hold ICT companies to account by ranking 26 of the most powerful digital platforms and telecoms companies on how well they uphold human rights that are fundamental to people's dignity and to our democracy. Today's webinar will be focused on the 12 most powerful telecommunication companies and RDR's evaluation of how transparent these telecom companies, or telcos, are on their policies related to users' fundamental rights, particularly freedom of expression and privacy. Telcos are still the primary provider of internet access globally, and their operations, which are licensed in each market that they operate in, are much more intimately tied in with governments, and hence they can be faced with issues around censorship, network shutdowns, especially when they operate within authoritarian regimes. Investors continue to urge ICT companies to prioritize human rights protections in their policies, practices, and in their business models. And we have and continue to have an investor statement on corporate accountability for digital rights, which are today signed by over 176 investors, and is really the basis of our direct engagement with ICT companies, which I'll tell you more about at the end of towards the end of this webinar. So with that, over to the webinar itself, I'm going to hand it off to Jan Ridziak in about a minute or so to tell us more about RDR's first ever Telco Giants Scorecard, where he will discuss the key findings, the trends in the digital rights performance of telcos, and emerging issues that we investors need to be aware about. We also have two of our investor colleagues, Lisa Cox from Christian Brothers Investment Services, a US-based firm, and Benjamin Chekron from Candriam, a Belgium-based investment management firm, to share with us their engagements with telcos. We had hoped to have a telco speak to us at this webinar as well, but unfortunately they pulled out a few days ago. So with that, Jan, I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Ran Yitzhak, who is the Company and Investment Engagement Manager at Ranking Digital Rights, a human rights program at New America. Jan is actually actively involved in developing and publishing of RDR scorecards and oversees dialogues with companies benchmarked as part of that benchmarking process to drive companies to improve their policies and practices. But he also works very closely with investors. He coordinates initiatives that aim to align shareholder expectation with human rights standards and supports them in engagements with companies. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jan, and thank you for taking your time to share this information with us, Jan.
Thank you right back, Anita. Thank you for organizing this webinar, and thank you everyone for coming. I know calendars are filling up at Mach 2 speeds at this point in the quarter, so we really appreciate that you chose to spend your valuable time with us today. So as I believe my screen should be visible. Anita, can you actually confirm that you can see it?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Wonderful. I believe that means that everybody else can as well.
Yes.
So excellent. So to set the scene a little bit, as Anita mentioned, for those of you who don't know us, we are a human rights benchmark that evaluates the world's largest and most powerful tech companies, as well as the world's most powerful telcos. So our mission is to essentially link the quality of their disclosures to human rights risks, to human rights impacts, and to human rights harms. And so in doing that, we emphasize, as Anita mentioned, freedom of expression and privacy, which to us and to the international human rights community writ large are essentially gateway rights. And in particular, that applies to these industries because they are supposed to, in principle, enable the speech of billions of users around the world, and to maintain, and at the same time, they maintain oceans of data about those users. So freedom of expression and privacy are gateway or enabling rights, in particular for tech companies and telcos. So our starting points in our analysis are the protection of human rights, clarity for the user, and transparency for the public. That's what we expect of companies in all of the policies that they disclose. And we have been assessing the public disclosures of these companies for exactly a decade now. Actually, 2023 is our 10th anniversary, so it's quite a good year to both try something new and to continue the successful work that we have done to date. Still on the sort of introduction side, here's a panorama of the topics that we look at in our evaluations, and that includes both the tech platforms and the telcos. So each of these categories breaks down into specific questions that total approximately 350 across 58 different indicators and are divided into the three pillars that you see here, right? So governance, freedom of expression, and privacy. So in terms of corporate governance, we start with high-level issues, high-level commitments to human rights, both freedom of expression and privacy. But the vast majority of the indicators that we evaluate companies on seek specific information on how companies put those commitments into action, right? The distinction between commitment and operationalization is essential for us and essential to the way that we approach companies. So for instance, in the governance category, when it comes to grievance mechanisms, remedy processes, we look for procedures or for companies to disclose procedures for assessing complaints regarding freedom of expression, regarding privacy. We look for timeframes. We look for evidence that that complaints are being handled, for instance. So fairly detailed, fairly granular questions that we think companies should always have the answer to and share that answer with the public. On freedom of expression, similarly, we start with a broad standard to make terms of service accessible to customers. But then again, we move on to specific processes, data on government demands, to censor websites, to suspend accounts, and to shut down entire communication systems and networks, especially in the case of telcos. So those are some of the things that we look for on the freedom of expression side. And in the privacy realm, once again, we sort of start high level. The basic expectation is that companies will have a clear privacy policy, but then again, we dive into disclosures about demands for customer data that companies get, how the companies themselves process users' data, and how they administer their security policies and how they translate them into practices, such as what companies do when they face a data breach, for instance. There is also a set of indicators and questions that cut across those three pillars. For instance, we ask companies for detailed policies on how they use algorithms in the freedom of expression category and how they develop them in the privacy category. All of these, I think many of you will recognize as risk factors. They are risk factors to the company, they're risk factors to investors, but most importantly, to the users who place their trust in those companies. This year we decided to produce a standalone assessment of the telecommunications companies, which previously, as Anita previously mentioned, formed one of the two arms of the RDR index, which I think will be familiar to a lot of you. And that was motivated by a number of things, but in general, tech giants like social media platforms in particular, they tend to cast a long shadow, and that shadow often obscures the equally severe human rights risks that stem from the telecom industry and the ways in which it operates. Telcos often wield far more power than platforms. They are, most people's first point of access to the internet, to messaging, to voice communication. They sign contracts with governments without which they simply cannot operate in a given jurisdiction, and that gives governments enormous leverage over the company. And of course, these risks are even greater when the company is state-owned and the state has a track record of flouting human rights norms, which is often the case. And of course, while there are plenty of similarities between social media platforms and tech giants and telcos, some of the risks are unique to the products those individual types of companies offer. So as in the past, this year we found that no company is doing well. In general, the leaders are best in a failing class is probably the most generous thing that we can say. Telcos generally perform worse than tech platforms across all three categories, and that translates to the total score. We believe that the lack of scrutiny and the jurisdictional disparities that we talked about are part of what accounts for that. And again, that means that a lot of companies are able to evade scrutiny simply because the freedom of expression and privacy are not quite as prominent topics of interest for the media, for in some cases regulators. So we believe that is partially responsible for the lower overall level of disclosure. The 2022 scorecard marks the first time that all of the 12 companies that we rank, or telcos that we rank, have published a general commitment to both freedom of expression and to privacy, thanks to new policies from Ooredoo and Axiata, which are based in Qatar and Malaysia, respectively. And then MTN is, which I've highlighted in this slide, is the best scoring company from the majority world, and for the first time has outpaced Orange, which is based in France. There we go. Okay, so the telcos that you see in our evaluation were last evaluated in the 2020 RDR index. So because the methodology hasn't really changed since then in a significant way, we are able to get a comparative view across those 2 years. And so MTN, which placed 6th overall, was the most improved company, and also the one that improved on the largest number of indicators, which is not always a correlation that is too obvious. Now, MTN's improvements, as well as the improvements of the next company to have the highest level of improvement, América Móvil, were driven largely by the fact that both companies produced their first transparency reports in 2020 for MTN and 2021 for América Móvil. And in both cases, that made them the first companies to produce a transparency report in their regions. Those reports addressed issues like how the companies handle demands for content or account blocking, for internet shutdowns. There are some metrics that, in fact, we haven't seen in other transparency reports, which is worth noting. And that drove score boosts for both companies on both freedom of expression and on privacy. I should say here, to a further reflection, the network effects that these kinds of milestones may drive should not be overlooked. I think it's for us, seeing these two reports was a sort of double milestone, and we believe that both companies should embrace their position as this newfound this newfound position as the vanguard in their regions and call for their peers in the region to strive for similar disclosures. Unfortunately, I think many of us will be familiar with the difference between publishing something and securing awareness of it, and understand that those are often two different things. So, for instance, in América Móvil's case, you will not find the transparency report anywhere on its website, even though it exists and it is public. So that is something to a specific sort of detail to note. On a more positive note, I would say no company score declined by more than half a point, actually. And as you see overall, the story is one of progress and improvement, although on individual indicators, there's still a little bit of backsliding. I wanted to highlight briefly that the freedom of expression category is still records the weakest performance among all the telcos. By far, in fact, privacy and governance outpaced freedom of expression in terms of the company's performance. Telcos scores on freedom of expression still really lag behind those on governance and privacy, although I will say that the pace of change in the freedom of expression category has picked up this year compared to last year. And again, the transparency reports from the two companies that I mentioned were part of the driver of the progress that we have seen. However, it is also worth noting that for a specific topic that we look at, which is internet shutdowns or network shutdowns, the overall level of disclosure is still very poor. The quality of the disclosures is still poor, and so if we do see progress, we see it on a fairly glacial pace. And then one perhaps not very obvious element that is certainly of interest to us and might be worth further analysis by those of you who are interested in telcos, is that there is a significant blind spot that we see in terms of enforcement of rules. So every company, every telco that we rank has some kind of list of what constitutes behavior that is not acceptable, right? So, for example, circulating spam, harassment, circulating illicit material. Those are codified into rules, but no company really produces any information on how they enforce those policies, right? So how many, for example, how many accounts were suspended for the circulation of such material. That is a very large distinction, I would say, between telcos and platforms, which have for many years been under intense scrutiny and intense pressure to publish this kind of information. And in both cases, it remains a risk factor for the users and customers of those companies. A few words on privacy. So telcos, as many of you will know, can access specific details about our daily lives, including things like location, SMS messages, which are not secure, web browsing history, app usage. Some of you may know that T-Mobile in the US is using app usage data to help third parties target ads, which ultimately can reveal personal details such as sexual orientation. There is an ongoing effort by companies to in the EU to collaborate, to use a charitable term, in order to come up with new ways to target ads to customers in light of the growing legislation and growing regulatory interest in regulating advertising. Telcos in general are even less transparent than big tech companies when it comes to disclosing what privacy policies they have and what practices they follow. They were also some of the last companies. Some of these companies were some of the last to publish a privacy policy in the first place. In fact, as of 2020, there were, I think, 2020 was the first year in which all of the telcos that we rank actually had a privacy policy that applied to their services. They also this year disclosed very little about how they collect user information via third parties, which can be collected from data brokers, for instance, or financial institutions, and is often used for things like determining credit scores. They also provided very limited information on how users can control the use of their personal data. 4 companies, for example, shared no information on that at all. And then 5 companies did not disclose whether they have a mechanism through which researchers can report vulnerabilities, which is part of the security battery of indicators. This is a, there's an important component, I think, to this conversation, which is that there is a wide gap between the head office or the headquarters of a given company and the subsidiaries. This is an entire work stream that we have internally at RDR, which focuses on working with dozens of civil society organizations and partners to get to the bottom of the discrepancies between the level of transparency that a company has at the group level and how much transparency there is among their subsidiaries. And the way that we do this is by giving those partners the tools they need to conduct their own evaluations using our standards or some variation of our standards that fits their needs the most. And that has produced a surge of recent adaptations that were focused especially on Asian and African markets. There are many more on the horizon for early this year, so please do look out for them. We are keenly aware, I would say, of the need to decolonize benchmarking, especially in industries where companies' local manifestations have such radically different profiles than the head office, right? So if there's a really large transparency gap between the group level and the many subsidiaries that a given company has, we think that's a problem. And that's a problem that directly affects the rights of the users, in the billions of users really in those countries. We also believe this is a direction that investors should prioritize in order to get a fuller picture of human rights risks around the world. And finally, starting to wrap up this part of the webinar. But in the last 2 years, I think we have noticed that responsible investors such as yourselves have really turned up the heat on all of the ranked telcos, and we encourage you, of course, to keep doing that or to join the current if you haven't already. And a few milestones or a few markers of this trend that I would highlight here is that 2022 marked the first year that every telecom company that we rank has produced an ESG report. Ooredoo was the last telco to do so, although in that case, its metrics emphasize issues like labor, community development, training, while omitting some key human rights issues. So I think this is an important conversation to have because it is clearly important to release ESG reports, but at the same time, if there are key metrics and key risks that are omitted, then that is there's the deficiencies are in a way more prominent and become more significant than what is actually contained in those reports. Also, in June of last year, the world's largest mobile industry group, the GSMA, cited RDR as the authoritative standard setter on digital rights policies, which we believe was a major milestone as well. That essentially encompasses the entirety of our indicators, and we believe that this will lead to some network effects and hopefully some scaling of awareness of human rights practices or best practices in human rights, specifically for the telco industry. And of course, we are continuing to inform the Investor Alliance's engagement initiative, which Anita mentioned before, that is targeting the ranked companies. This has really helped build pressure from all directions for those companies to improve. Several investors have discussed the initiative in their engagement reports, and it's tremendously useful for us to know about them as they get published. So, please do stay in touch with the Investor Alliance and RDR if you are a part of that initiative. And this, I promise you, is the final slide that I have for you. So just on a sort of high-level reflection, there are many paths that we can take from here, but we as an organization believe that one of the critical challenges for this year will be to examine to what extent human rights expectations make it into ESG data, how human rights standards are translated into ESG data and expectations, how benchmarks inform and complement each other, because I know that many of you use multiple benchmarks to inform your investment decisions. And of course, how to settle on strong overarching frameworks without letting companies off the hook. That is a conversation we would love to have with you, either on this webinar today or in the future. And we are also at a point where we want to look beyond the tech/telco dichotomy and into new industries that should be held to the same standard, but again, evade scrutiny because they're tech adjacent. And so many of the risks that we're talking about here today are not typically associated with them. So we would love to hear from all of you on what your priorities are, what gaps you see, what sectors and what companies you would like to dig into, and how we can support that work. So please don't be shy in reaching out if we haven't reached out to you already. And thank you all for listening. I look forward to your questions, and I will pass the mic back to Anita.
Thanks so much for that, Jan. Just one quick question before I let you go, just in terms of the way the benchmarks are pulled together, because you talked about the fact that there were sort of over 350 questions that are asked of telcos or of ICT companies. How are those questions, just in terms of how are those questions asked? Is this, do you answer those questions yourself, or are telcos actually given that opportunity to answer the questions? Just wanted to get that idea of the methodology or, the process before we kind of jumped into the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much for that question. There are so many assumptions that we can make. We live and breathe this, so it's very easy to assume that everybody knows exactly how we operate. So yes, the fundamental rule here is that we assess their policies independently, and ultimately the decisions that we make are up to our individual researchers. That entails several layers of sort of verification, which cuts across months of research. So it's not just that two researchers need to agree on something, it's that at multiple stages we verify the same information repeatedly. But as you noted, there is an important role here for companies themselves to play, which is that they provide feedback on a sort of alpha version of our results. And that is also several months in advance of publication. Many benchmarks do this. It is, I think there is a widespread recognition that it is important to involve the companies in this process, in part, of course, to ensure the integrity of the whole process, and to ensure that no major mistakes are made. Ultimately, we are all human beings, human researchers, even when in some cases, some benchmarks are sort of supported by algorithms. We are entirely human decision-making based. And so companies do have the opportunity to provide detailed and ample feedback. We take that feedback into account. There are, again, multiple layers of verification, and we make a final determination based on that. So there is a sort of back and forth process and an actual lively conversation, of course, sometimes very emotional, that stems from that.
No, great. Thanks so much for that, Jan. And that was important, for us to know as well, because as we kind of investors really look at this data in order to understand the performances of companies around different indicators across the human rights sort of framework. And so understanding that process, the amount of research that goes into that, the discussion with companies, allows for us to know. And that's why we rely on RDR data for the engagement. And with that, with that research, I wanted to really hand this off to Benjamin Chekron, who's from Candriam, to tell us a little bit more about the way Candriam uses this data in their engagements, what kind of engagements they have, how has this progressed, what are the challenges. And before I hand it off to Benjamin, just a quick bio on Benjamin. He joined Candriam in 2018 as the deputy head of convertible bonds and assumed his current position in stewardship in 2020. He is in charge of Candriam's social and human rights engagement efforts, and in fact was a co-author of Candriam's facial recognition tech and human rights investor guidance, which is part of a separate investor collective engagement. Although today we're talking about telcos, And so with that, wanted to hand it off to Benjamin, who is very much a tech expert and an investment expert in this space, to share his views. Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Anita. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy New Year. So we've been part of this experience of engaging telcos as part of the RDR engagement. We've been active on 2 European telcos. And we've recently had a call with quite a few investors. I'm sure they're on the call. I saw a few names pop up on the participants. We had a recent call with one of the companies. So I'm going to be very careful, because obviously that those conversations are confidential. But I'll kind of describe it in a way. Let's say it's not the best performing European telco on the ranking digital rights index, but there was a couple of maybe 2 or 3 points that were quite interesting in our conversations. Obviously, the way we handle those conversations is we try and book meetings with the relevant officers on human rights or ESG in those companies, and we try to ask them about the RDR assessment, how they feel about it, where they feel they can improve, and just maybe 2 or 3 points that were quite insightful. This company we spoke to is active in Europe, but also has quite a lot of exposure to emerging and high risk countries outside of Europe, and obviously the world is becoming a riskier place, and obviously the last few months have seen a lot of political and geopolitical crises popping up, and it puts telcos in complicated positions. I think this company uses an external firm to help them assess levels of risk in countries. They use someone called Verisk Maplecroft, who most of you are familiar with. But we thought that the threshold they were using was actually quite low. I mean, some countries we consider to be very high risk didn't come up on their kind of high risk radar. That was one thing. This telco in particular was ranking pretty bad in terms of transparency. I think that we were kind of always complaining about the level of their transparency report and granularity of the data that was on this report, and this company kind of when we talked to them about specific government requests, this company kind of said that they try to refuse to comply, and they always try to delay, and sometimes they end up in situations where they have to they have to cut the network, or sometimes the network was actually cut. In fact, they said they've had situations where cables were cut. And that also now we're in times where there's more and more technologies coming in, and also that it's harder for telco to manage these situations, and sometimes they lose control on government actions, and that governments are able to shut down without the telecom operator kind of being able to do anything. The way they see those situations is that these situations are worth their engagement effort. They try to they try to prevent those situations, and they try to not wait for crisis to happen. They know that these things are always going to happen ahead of elections, and that's so they try to to warn the public, the government. They try to engage with NGOs, and they communicate a kind of clear message to say that, okay, if the network's going to be cut down, shut down, it's not our fault, it's the government. So that's kind of puts the government in an odd position sometimes, and they feel that that's that's the right way to act. But they very much they wouldn't give us a lot of specifics or a lot of specific details on the processes they have in place. So they prefer to say that they are actively engaging rather than disclosing, which is kind of interesting. Sometimes it's a something we are as investors kind of, should we disengage, or should we what's gonna happen? And they kind of claim sometimes that it could be worse off to leave one of these markets to an operator that's going to have less scrutiny and less and lower ethical standards. So I think the situation in Myanmar and Telenor is kind of an interesting example of that. This telco in particular is always hiding behind employee security to also explain the low level of transparency they can give out on their reports. So kind of saying, well, we feel we would be putting our employees at risk if we did say that how much went on in terms of government requests or in that country or that country. So but the person we spoke to said that there was a real internal struggle in terms of the amount of data they could share with investors. So between the kind of HR people and the top executives. That was interesting. I've got also a point on data privacy. We were kind of seeing that this company had much higher standards in terms of data privacy in Europe versus riskier countries. Obviously, in Europe we have GDPR, and they were trying to be as compliant as possible and have high standards there. And they were introducing higher standards, but of course they were starting to do them in Europe, where it's less necessary. So it kind of goes back a little bit to what Jan was referring to, with differences between kind of home countries or home regions and emerging markets. Just maybe one more point on this company didn't care much, let's say, about the RDR assessment. They were not greatly concerned, and I think that they felt that there were some differences in timing of reporting that was more favorable to other operators. And that sometimes their reporting didn't have the right wording, or I don't know if it's translation issues also, that meant that sometimes or often they didn't get full points on the RDR. So there was some sort of friction there that we experienced. So so that's on some points we're experiencing when engaging with telcos. On the back of the work done by the RDR.
No, thanks so much.
I'll leave it there. Back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that, Benjamin, and for really sharing with us some of the details there. I think it's interesting for all of us on the call to hear that. I think it will open up a little bit more discussion maybe during the Q&A about that sort of difference between standards at the headquarter level through to subsidiary level. The fact that a lot of telcos are going into riskier environments to provide services. And whilst that is important, because we want to have, particularly for telcos, because you want to have access to the internet, what kind of protocols have they put in place? Vodafone has just gone into Ethiopia as part of a joint venture, for example. And I know that wasn't the company that you were talking about, so just to make it clear out there. So I think that will be for some good discussion later. But I wanted to hand it off to Lisa to also share her experiences with engaging with telcos. Lisa is a human rights lawyer with over 25 years of experience working on rule of law and access to justice issues. During that time, she worked with companies and communities worldwide to prevent human trafficking, promote equality and respect for rights of workers, and fighting against the exploitation and abuse of children. And we'll hear more about that when Lisa speaks. She currently works with the Impact and Justice team at Christian Brothers Investment Services, and she has been working at CBS with several large tech and telecom companies, particularly to improve their response to online sexual exploitation of children. So with that, I wanted to hand off to Lisa to share with us her experience then engaging with telcos, and also how she can see the RDR data sort of enabling her to understand some of the issues, even where those issues might not be specifically tackled by the benchmark, and how that allows also in terms of future planning. So with that, Lisa, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks, Anita. And thanks, Jan, for the great work that RDR is doing in this space. So yeah, as Anita mentioned, I was going to take a little bit of time today to just talk about our engagement with AT&T, which we've been, I've been at CBIS for a little over a year, but the firm has been engaging with AT&T since 2018. And our focus has largely been on getting the company to do more to combat online sexual exploitation of children, including child sex trafficking, storage of child sex abuse material, grooming, sextortion. And although RDR's, the benchmarks don't touch specifically on child protection, it does cover issues that are related to governance and human rights due diligence and transparency and reporting. And all of those are really relevant to the work we're doing as well. So we find actually the data to be really helpful and important, not only the data on with AT&T, but also the similar businesses that we can kind of point to that are doing better or worse. So we're really appreciative of the work. Just a quick summary of some of the work we've been doing with AT&T. Some of our specific asks, they're largely around just getting them to be more transparent and doing better with disclosures on frameworks that are guiding their responses to the issue of child sexual exploitation, being more transparent about how they partner with outside organizations, how the board of directors has oversight over these risks, and what really wanting to know more what resources and attention the company is giving to identifying new trends involving sexual exploitation of minors that might involve AT&T's platforms, their products, their services. And one of our big asks was that they conduct a child rights impact assessment and share the findings. And they did that about 2.5 years ago, that they conducted a CRIA, and they we've been, asking for them to share more about the findings from that impact assessment, and importantly, what they're doing with the findings, how are they implementing the recommendations. And they're, like with all companies, they're, especially around the topic of child sexual exploitation, they're quite hesitant. They don't, want that horrible crime to be associated with their company, but they also acknowledge that that it's important to talk about it and to get it out there, what the challenges are and how they're the success they're having in dealing with it. And so we look at the RDR's benchmark on issues related to oversight of board level oversight, how well they've outlined their due diligence process for algorithm development, how well they're engaging with civil society. They've done well on the benchmark in those areas. They seem to have also done well on describing how their due diligence process for government content restriction requests are handled. And these are all really relevant to our work as well. It's often sort of, unfortunately, privacy interests, which RDR focuses a lot on, are often described as at odds with child protection, that it's impossible to have both. Because with encryption, it's harder for law enforcement to find the perpetrators of exploitation online. And so we don't think that they should be at odds. We think there is a lot of room for common ground, and that the more we can understand how companies are dealing with privacy, we can try to, and working with organizations like RDR, to really come together and not see this as an either or, but really how to do both. And so the more we can get the data on privacy and how companies deal with that, the more we can have those conversations. Some of the places that AT&T still needs improvement, according to the benchmark, are improving transparency around their enforcement of their own policies. They don't share very much data about how they protect users from risks. They haven't published policies on data retention, and they remove data documents. They removed a document explaining how they use algorithmic systems to identify behavior that violates company rules, and clearly any sort of child exploitation would fall under that. So it's interesting to see that those are areas that are needing improvement. We are going to have a call in the next month or two with AT&T to just a check-in call to see how they're doing, and we're going to definitely use this latest scorecard to highlight some of these areas for improvement, and also applaud them for the good progress that they have made. And we'll get their reaction to the scorecard and see how they plan to address the findings, and keep the conversation going.
No, thanks so much for that, Lisa. And I think one of the points that you raised when you were talking, when you were sharing your experience as well, is the issue of how leadership within telcos really take responsibility and are accountable for human rights risks. Whilst in our discussion, we are getting into sort of the details of policies, how they are enforced, etc. Really, the board of directors, the leaders of the company, the senior management need to have that responsibility, and that will be how it drives change. And a lot of times how we also end up holding leaders to, or the board to be more accountable, is through the proxy season and the filing of shareholder proposals, which is pretty popular with the US companies in particular. And so just a quick call out as well, that proxy season is in full steam ahead, and that we want to hold, apart from really engaging with continuing engagements, is to really put the leaders of the companies at to call them out and for them to take that responsibility. And so as we start off sort of question and answer session, and please wanted to ask the participants on the call, we have a great trove of experience here amongst the panelists, and so please share any questions that you may have, whether for the panelists or specifically as well relating to any companies that are assessed by RDR. But before we kind of jump into that first question, I just wanted to ask all the panelists, just flowing from that question or from the point that I raised earlier, how can we better, or how do you see yourselves engaging with the board of directors, senior management, to drive change in terms of the digital rights, and whether there are any sort of challenges you face or any positive experiences you've seen? Anything here to share? Jan, did you have something?
Of course,
Yeah.
sure. I'm happy to fill the brief silence. So I think in our experience, although we don't tend to talk to members of the boards of individual companies, in our experience, what really helps drive progress, and this might sound a little self-explanatory to many of you, but what helps drive progress in companies is the sort of parallel movement at the top and among the sort of lower or middle management level, I think, of the companies, right? So we have seen this in several cases over the last couple of years, especially. I would say there's been a lot of progress, for example, on MTN's side. Now not so new, but 2 years ago, a relatively new CEO of MTN had a specific strategy to maximize disclosures on ESG issues, including human rights issues. And that led to multiple new position statements on human rights, as well as unprecedented really disclosures in transparency reports. Right? It's again would like to sort of reinforce the fact that it is very rare to see the kind of details that MTN released in its transparency reports from a company that ultimately does operate in several challenging environments. Right? But at the same time, I think we should not, lose track of the fact that, sometimes there are, companies, whether it's on the decision is at the board level or at a different level, companies sometimes, use the excuse of, for example, minority ownership to divest themselves of the responsibility to disclose certain things, right? This year, for example, one of the big themes in both our conversations with companies and in our research as a whole was that if a company owns 49% of a given subsidiary, sometimes that is enough for them to be convinced that there is no requirement or necessity for them to disclose something. That is not the case, right? It's very easy to shift that responsibility. So that's something to keep in mind.
Great. No, thank you. I don't know, Lisa, Benjamin, do you have anything to add to that? Lisa.
Yeah, I would just say we during my time here, we haven't had interaction with the board ourselves, but we do speak with in our engagement with AT&T, with their child protection folks and human rights folks. We emphasize the importance that they let the board know about the work that they're doing in this area and the risks that they're finding when they that came out of the impact assessment, that the board understands really what's at risk here. And we feel like, if they can get a champion on the board, then that understands the problem and that is willing to dedicate significant resources to it, the better we'll all be. So that it's that kind of conversation we have in our engagement about board involvement, but haven't had the opportunity or the need to address things with the board directly during my time engaging with them, because AT&T has actually done quite a good job on this. We're quite proud of the work they've done. So
great, thanks. Benjamin?
Yeah, just one comment. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that it felt like there's the struggle between people that are at the human rights level that want to do better and want to push for things, but like the top management doesn't probably get it. So I think it's really important that those guys feel pressure from from everywhere, from from maybe us as investors, whenever there's shareholder resolutions that we vote on them, that they hear our voice, but also coming from other parts like research agencies, ESG research agencies, for example, that the word gets out. So I think it's all this needs to get out, not just in this little community of kind of like investors, versus companies kind of thing. It's got to come from everywhere.
And Benjamin, since you're just on that, we had a question from one of the members of one of the participants to say, what kind of, do you use tangible case studies? What do you use in order to convince investment folks that are less savvy on human rights from a materiality perspective with telcos? Is there anything to add to that? I mean, we do, as you said, how do we broaden that engagement? How do we convince more investors and other stakeholders that it's material to engage on human rights issues? Any suggestions there? But I guess these reports, Benjamin.
I'll pass on that one. Sorry, I'm not.
No worries.
Good enough.
No, I mean, I guess I'll try and take that in the context of, we do see that if you take Telenor, for example, as one case study, and how they then responded to the situation in Myanmar and their exit from Myanmar. So I think firstly, folks saw that Telenor's situation and providing transparency in Myanmar when the military junta took over was really seen to be, fairly exemplary in a difficult situation. And I think there was a lot of support, and there continues to be a lot of support for Telenor. Telenor then made that decision to exit. And that drove some amount of criticism, and goes to the space where we want to see telcos who have strong and rigorous policies in place to continue their business operations there, so that we can continue to provide a voice for people. But at the same time, in that sort of scenario, they are now in discussion about providing remediation to as a result of that exit. So, that's a great case study sort of overall to see how this, and then their share price, the amount of impact on their reputational risks as well, were some great examples of, how this really played into the issue of materiality. With that, and just looking quickly, there's a question that, I note there's 3 minutes left. So Jan, I'm just going to put one question to you. In terms of the gap between headquarters and subsidiary performance, do you have a sense in some specific instances how disparate the scores would be for headquarters versus subsidiaries? And which ranked areas, governance, freedom of expression, or privacy, are those that display the biggest gap?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and thank you to whoever asked it. There are many examples that we can cite from the individual adaptations. One that comes to mind is that the commitment to net neutrality and zero rating differs substantially between the home operating market and various subsidiaries. That is driven in part kind of by what Benjamin was alluding to, which is that obviously for the European telcos, there's a much stronger expectation of privacy protection than in many of the subsidiaries, where that simply those protections simply don't extend to those markets. And so, for instance, from the recent adaptations that we have supported, we have seen that Vodafone subsidiaries in Tanzania, Mozambique, Lesotho do not have the same net neutrality commitments that the headquarters does have. I will say though that it's good to see some of these companies, and I would actually highlight Vodafone here. Very willingly and in good faith engaging with those civil society partners who are based in those countries and having those conversations, because being a small civil society organization limits the amount of power that you have with multinational corporations such as telcos, and it's good to see expressions of goodwill and actual conversations being scheduled between those two parties.
Well, with that, thanks so much for that, Jan. And I mean, we've got a couple of seconds left, so I'm just going to really take the time to thank all our panelists for giving their time to us today to share their experiences. And just wanted to give a quick call out to the work that both Benjamin, Lisa, and Jan are a part of, where we have a collective investor engagement with ICT companies addressing these exact rights of privacy and freedom of expression. We have an investor statement on corporate accountability of digital rights, which is the basis of our engagement. So if you're interested, please sign up to that statement and join our bi-monthly ICT and human rights working calls. We have a number of tools as well, and happy to provide links to those. Two quick things before we close. One is we do have an investor statement coming out relating to some policy work in the digital space relating to Artificial Intelligence Act in the EU, so look out for that towards the end of the month. And just most importantly, as we go, the investor voice is important in this discussion, so please do use your proxies this 2023 season to really, let the board and know how you feel about the companies and how you want them to really build shareholder value and just, value per se on a long-term basis. So with that, thank you very much to everyone, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anita. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.